Lecture 3, Havana Syndrome. The man in the mid-rise near Linear Wide woke into a sound that felt like a zipper being pulled inside his skull. It was 2017, humid Havana, and he was the kind of security engineer who measures the world instead of describing it. He tried ear clamping, pillow swapping, hallway stepping. Palms didn't help, turning the pillow only sleuthed the phantom's bearing by a few degrees, and stepping into the corridor snapped the sensation off like a light. 2 weeks later his dynamic visual acuity test, letters at 2 Hz while the head turns, went to mush. A vestibular therapist wrote, VORX1, 15 seconds, TID, on a pad. A career shrank to moving a business card in front of his eyes on schedule. The politics outside the department were grandstanding and press releases. Inside, it was physics and neurophysiology and the specific hell of a nervous system that can be battered by a stimulus that leaves no fingerprint. The first cluster was late 2016, in embassy apartments and hotels between Vedado and Old Havana. The symptom set was maddeningly consistent in the acute cases: directional, localizable sensation, a pressure or metallic insectile noise, then nausea, tinnitus, vertigo, and cognitive static that did not file itself away after sleep. US and Canadian personnel were the index cases. Washington cut staff in September 2017. Ottawa followed in early 2018. By 2019 the phrase, Havana Syndrome, had been promoted from newsroom nickname to oversight acronym and a legislative line item. The Havana Act, 2021, created a compensation architecture so agencies would stop gaslighting their own people via budget. The geography refused to stay in the Caribbean. 2021 saw Vienna, 24+ reports, Berlin, police investigations opened in October, and Bogotá, embassy families affected in October. That August, Vice President Kamala Harris's flight from Singapore to Hanoi held for hours after the embassy reported a possible anomalous health incident, the government's deliberately bland term of art. By March 2023 the U.S. intelligence community said most of the roughly 1,500 reports across 96 countries did not wear an adversary's fingerprints. The same paragraph left a small bin of cases unresolved. Dates matter. So do numbers. Board prose on official letterhead matters more than tweets. Crickets arrived like a Greek chorus and, for once, they were literal. The Associated Press released one representative attack recording in 2017. In 2019 two biologists, Alexander Stubbs and Fernando Montilla Gazed, matched its pulse repetition rate, spectral envelope, and within pulse oscillations to the calling song of the Indies short-tailed cricket, Anurogryllus celerinictus. That paper studiously avoided saying anything about injuries. It said the sound on the tape was a singing insect echoing off hard surfaces, not a sci-fi device. The lesson is boring and essential. Audio captured after the fact is a terrible biomarker for a mechanism. You start with sensors and geometry, not with a soundtrack and a headline. Ultrasound had its cameo next. A 2018 to 2019 line of work showed how two inaudible ultrasonic sources can intermodulate in air and synthesize audible byproducts that mimic the AP recording's spectral features. Parametric arrays can paint audio like a flashlight beam at short range. Museums buy them so one visitor hears a whisper no one else can hear. They are real and they are absurdly needy. Powerful transducers, careful alignment, and a range budget that collapses fast in air, especially through glass. If ultrasound ever played a role in any incident, the geometry would be tight and boringly terrestrial. Transducer on a balcony or in a vehicle, lope through an open aperture, operator cursing the weather. That still would not explain delayed vestibular dysfunction, only the noise at onset. Sound doesn't produce invisible lesions, it wrecks ears, not MRIs. Then the microwaves walked in wearing lab coats older than most of the officials giving interviews. In the early 1960s Alan H. Fry described the microwave auditory effect, microsecond scale radio frequency, RF, pulses, at low average powers but high peak powers, producing clicks and zips perceived in the head via thermoelastic expansion in brain tissue and bone. James C. Lynn wrote the monograph in 1978 that sits on every RF bioeffects shelf like a radiator. Thresholds are measured in pulse energy. The percept is directional. It can be delivered through glass at tens of meters because you are coupling energy volumetrically, not pushing air. RF hearing does not require conspiracy, it requires a pulse train and a head. This is not proof of a weapon in any one courtyard, it's proof that the mechanism behind the most cinematic onset descriptions sits inside textbooks. History provides a caution and a credential. From 1953 to 1976 the Soviets bathed the US Embassy in Moscow with a 2.5 to 4.0 GHz beam at microwatt per square centimeter levels, the infamous Moscow signal. It produced decades of bickering and experiments under names like Project Pandora and Bizarre, Epidemiology failed to show a neat cancer bump, physiology failed to show nothing at all. It's a parable with a moral fit for adults. A major power did point RF at an embassy for decades, and no one could agree what it meant for bodies. If your appetite for certainty survives that sentence, you should not be anywhere near a lab or a briefing. The modern US government did what modern governments do, it convened cautious people. In December 2020, a National Academies panel chaired by Stanford's David Relman read the early acute cases closely and wrote the phrase that still makes both skeptics and true believers grind teeth. Directed, pulsed radiofrequency energy is a plausible initiating mechanism, plausible, not proven, and the government should build a triage and instrumentation playbook instead of anecdotage. In 2022 a redacted JSON review arrived with the personality of a bandsaw. Pulsed RF is physically plausible, air ultrasound across streets is not, and fantasies that skip beam steering, walls, and power budgets should be composted. In March 2023, the intelligence community's unclassified assessment said 5 agencies judged a foreign adversary very unlikely, for most cases, 1 judged it unlikely, and 1 kept its powder dry, an updated iteration in January. 2025 retained the same center of gravity while acknowledging a rump of unresolved cases. Adult reading comprehension required, most, is not, all, very unlikely, is not, impossible, and no device found that explains thousands of reports, is not the same as no one ever pulsed anybody. Medicine rolled in with charts and a fire extinguisher. In March 2024, 2 NILED studies in JAMA reported that affected personnel, drawn from posts far beyond Cuba, had severe, persistent symptoms, imbalance, headaches, fatigue, mood disturbance, but across cohorts their structural MRIs and blood biomarkers did not form a consistent injury signature. A large subset met criteria for persistent postural perceptual dizziness, PPPD, a brain-body loop where an acute vestibular insult leads to maladaptive hypervigilance and chronic disequilibrium. No lesions is not, no harm. An MRI is blind to many transient pressure insults, but the nulls flatten the more cinematic claims of a unique, scan-visible brain disorder confined to spies. The good news that a radiologist cannot spot you in a blind read does nothing to shorten a hallway that won't hold still. Journalism then did what journalism sometimes does, it set the room on fire. In March and July 2024, a collaboration among the Insider, Der Spiegel, and CBS's 60 Minutes dumped receipts onto the table, travel manifests, phone metadata, and victim identifications placing officers from Russia's GRU Unit 29155, already tied to the 2018 Novichok poisoning in Salisbury, the 2015 organophosphate attack on Bulgarian arms dealer Emilian Gabrev, and depot explosions in Czechia, near multiple victims in multiple cities. A U.S. official's spouse in Tbilisi identified Albert Averyanov, son of the unit's commander, outside her home around the time a piercing unilateral noise dropped her to her knees. An earlier 2014 case in Frankfurt, 2 years before Havana had a brand, featured a U.S. employee felled by a rising pressure wave and a high-pitched squeal, then later identifying a Geneva-based 29155 officer. Internal Russian documents rewarded senior 29,155 men for non-lethal acoustic weapons work, a doctrinal bucket that lumps ultrasound and pulsed RF because both produce acoustic artifacts in the skull. The Kremlin called it baseless, the travel records didn't blush. If you want to know how an open society should hold 2 thoughts at once, it is this: investigative reporters can plant named officers near victims at specific times, and intelligence agencies can still be right that a single global campaign is not the best explanation for most reports. One of those scenes, the laundry room in Tbilisi, the 7th of October, 2021, has the geometry RF engineers draw on napkins, line of sight through a window, a domestic room with reflective surfaces, a unilateral onset, and an operator where he should not be. Another, Frankfurt, autumn 2014, puts Unit 29155 officers in Schengen's bloodstream, with Geneva hotel bookings under false identities, rail connections, and a US victim who remembers the sequence in a way vestibular clinicians recognize: surge, vomit, collapse, disequilibrium, then an upgrade from vestibular neuritis to traumatic brain injury when testing deepens. These are not proofs, they are plots that fit the physics better than most. You can audit the easier culprits without insulting anybody. Crickets explain recordings, not chronic vestibulopathy. Ultrasound explains a sound, not a year of dizziness, and it dies against glass like a moth. Organophosphate exposure from aggressive Z-clearer fumigation, the Canadian-funded study's favorite suspect, predicts cholinesterase dips, cholinergic symptoms, and clusters matching spray schedules and routes. Some Canadian cohorts showed suggestive biomarkers and blood-brain barrier permeability changes. But when Global Affairs Canada wrapped its multi-year review in 2024, it concluded that pre-existing conditions, environmental factors, and conventional illnesses likely explained many cases and that a malicious actor was not supported by their evidence. You can hate bureaucrats, but you cannot hate a result into existence. The hard science is unglamorous and quantitative. A pulsed RF hypothesis that fits the crispest early onset's needs. 1. Peak electric fields high enough to drive thermoelastic transients in cranial tissue, microsecond pulses. Pulse energies on the order of a few millijoules at the head can cross perceptual thresholds in controlled settings. 2. Beam control tight enough to spare neighbors and the operator from side lobes. And 3. Average power low enough to leave thermal signatures and regulatory monitors asleep. Those requirements sketch an ugly box on a tripod powered by batteries that hate their lives, not a death ray. If you want the adult version of how would you catch it, you seat suspect rooms with wideband spectrum analyzers, 0.5 to 18 GHz, microsecond resolution, GPS-disciplined clocks, tack up field mills for quasi-static spikes, and MEMS MIC arrays to assassinate the next cricket headline in real time, and baseline the human being's video head impulse, calorics, auditory brainstem responses, before deployment so you can subtract their lives from their symptoms when the diary says, it just happened. Again, 2113. Then you align logs to milliseconds and look for correlations. That's not James Bond, it's the only way adults earn the right to say, unknown. If you feel déjà vu here, you should. When the Navy argued with itself in the 1960s about a microwave beam at our Moscow embassy, epidemiology, physics, and politics took turns playing lead, and the finale was ambiguity wrapped in metal mesh. The National Security Archive's declassified files show power densities of only a few to a dozen microwatts per square centimeter for years. The US ran animal experiments and contemplated, then abandoned, human ones. Decades later the argument still ends with shrug emojis in footnotes. The moral is not that microwaves are harmless or that panic is wise, it is that chronic low-level exposure writes a grey record and that arguments about causation age poorly when your instruments and priors are bad. Havana inherits that file folder whether it wants to or not. The other inheritance is social. Once an institution names a syndrome, the signal-to-noise ratio collapses. By 2021, reports arrived from London hotels, Berlin embassies, South American capitals, and, notoriously, inside the Beltway, the New Yorker wrote Vienna pieces with spy novel cadence. Congressional letters multiplied like tribbles. The intelligence community's 2023 assessment spoke in the cautious dialect of probability. Most agencies, very unlikely, an adversary for most cases. That sentence is a guardrail against a real error, confusing a category label with a mechanism. AHI is a bucket, not a cause. There can be targeted pulsed RF events in Tbilisi or Frankfurt and, simultaneously, hundreds of unrelated cases worldwide where vestibular insults and stress and expectation wrote PPPD into people's lives. Adult epistemology refuses to let one clean narrative eat the rest. There is comedy here if you can stomach gallows humor. A 2019 paper demoted a global scandal's soundtrack to a horny cricket. A parametric loudspeaker once sold to museums for whispers got drafted into op-eds as a Bond gadget, then retired as the math sobered up. A Senate report in late 2024 scolded the CIA for erratic care while agreeing with the analysts about adversaries and most cases. Meanwhile, a 2024 primetime broadcast asked viewers to remember faces and named a GRU commander's son. This is not what clarity looks like, this is what modern fact-finding looks like when physiology, tradecraft, and bureaucracies share an apartment. The only respectable way forward is procedural. Geometry before adjectives is a rule, not a quip. Line of sight matters because beams obey trigonometry, windows matter because RF couples through glass while ultrasound bounces like a slap. On-off timing matters because fact cycles masquerade as malevolence. Neighbors and vans matter because batteries weigh more than bravado. The first thing into a live scene is a passive wideband logger, not a committee. The second is silence about audio until an array of microphones has eviscerated the insect kingdom. The third is invisible killers, carbon monoxide meters and, when plausible, cholinesterase assays. If symptoms look pulse-like, you change the room's Faraday properties, mesh, mylar, foil, in controlled steps while the logger and the patient share timestamps. If the words boring and protocol don't appear in your plan, you are designing television, not an investigation. And yes, the story still has a villain who might be a physics problem on a tripod, and another who is a social loop that eats sick people's lives. Unit 29155 is not a message board rumor. European prosecutors link it to real explosions and real poisonings. The Insider and 60 Minutes put its officers near victims in Tbilisi and Frankfurt and surfaced Soviet and Russian programs. Reductor in Kharkiv in 1984, later, non-lethal acoustic procurement, that show the state funded the preconditions for mischief. The intelligence community's analysts can be right that most cases are not a campaign. Meanwhile, a person in a Havana apartment, Vienna townhouse, or Tbilisi laundry room hears a noise that moves with the head and stops at the door, and their vestibular tests go weird for months. The adult posture, the only one that doesn't defraud the sick or feed the credulous, is to hold the two files open at once and insist on instruments, not incantations. The year the investigation finally grew teeth, the story did not start in Havana. It began, cinematically and stupidly, with laundry in Digomi, an upscale district of Tbilisi, Georgia, on October 7, 2021, at roughly the hour when a dryer's hum becomes the soundtrack of domestic confidence. An American nurse, call her Joy, because the reporting protects her real name, reached into the drum and was hit by a sound that didn't travel through air so much as arrive inside her skull, high-pitched, bomb after the blast tinnitus, piercing, unilateral, a vector from the window into the left ear, followed by head fullness, a pressure wave, and the body's ancient decisions, vomit, flee, scan for the threat. She did what survival schools teach, get off the X, and check the door camera. Outside the gate, a black Mercedes crossover. On the street, a tall, slim, conspicuously blonde man with the posture of someone who has never once lost an argument with a mirror. She raised her phone, he locked eyes, slid into the Mercedes, and left. Months later, shown a photograph of 23-year-old Albert Avaryanov, the son of Andrei Avaryanov, commander of Russia's GRU Unit 29155. She had the kind of visceral recognition that makes your nervous system file a complaint against your memory. The medical plot turned worse, daily headaches for years, superior semicircular canal dehiscence on both sides, 2 skull surgeries to patch the innery bony labyrinth with metal plates, a neurosurgeon with explanations in the conditional tense. This was not a Cuban alley in 2016, this was the post-Crimea shadow war in a Georgian suburb, written in otology and license plates and the kind of bad luck that feels like design. By the time 60 Minutes and Der Spiegel aired and published in March-April 2024, the investigation had spent 5 years collecting the boring kinds of evidence that become dramatic only in stacks: travel reservations, hotel receipts, call data records, intercepted chatter, personnel awards, and the testimonies of officials still half-living inside classification regimes. The joint team, the Insider in Riga, CBS's 60 Minutes in New York, and Der Spiegel in Hamburg, did not claim omniscience, they claimed chronology. They placed identifiable operatives of the GRU's Unit 29155, the same sabotage cadre tied to the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, 2018, and munitions depot blasts in Czechia and Bulgaria, 2011 to 2015, in the right cities just before or during clusters of anomalous health incidents. They surfaced a piece of Russian military accounting in which a 29155 officer is rewarded for research on the potential capabilities of non-lethal acoustic weapons, phrasing that in Russian military literature lumps radio frequency, microwave, devices that create auditory artifacts with ultrasonic sources that abuse innery mechanics. Where American committees use acronyms, this operation left purchase orders. The Frankfurt thread is the one that makes intelligence officers swear under their breath because it predates the brand name. In late 2014, years before Havana syndrome became a phrase, at least one U.S. government employee at the Frankfurt consulate reportedly experienced a sudden pressure wave beginning in the torso, radiating to head and neck, accompanied by a high-pitched squeal, followed by emesis and loss of consciousness. The victim, diagnosed later with a traumatic brain injury, recalled confronting a tall man with a Russian accent loitering around consulate housing and photographing US-plated cars. When investigators later shared images of GRU officer Igor Gordienko, then working out of Geneva, identification was immediate. Travel and booking data examined by the reporting team placed Major General Denis Sergeyev, a veteran of Unit 29155's overseas work, Gordienko, and other 29,155 officers in Geneva hotels in late September to mid-October 2014, then inside the Schengen zone with the internal ID laxity that makes European rail and air hops feel like bus tickets. The timeline sits precisely on the runway of the Frankfurt event window. It reads like a choreography: reconnaissance, staging, strike, exfiltration. Back in Tbilisi, the OSINT moves were as prosaic as they were damning. Phone books, a thing spies also keep, showed Albert Avarianov's number in multiple 29,155 operatives' contact lists. His device went conspicuously dark during the Digomi incidents, and someone inside the city logged into his personal email near the time of the attacks. The team also surfaced an intercepted Russian-language call nearby in which a man asked, "Is it supposed to have blinking green lights? And, should I leave it on all night?" Absurd lines if you're troubleshooting a blender, memorable lines if you imagine a field-deployed emitter with status LEDs that should have been taped over. You don't need to accept every inference to appreciate the chain, geolocated presence, sat-nav breadcrumbs, signals intelligence oddities, and a victim's identification of a face that connects to a father whose job description reads like a Bond villain's resume written without shame. The phrase that made seasoned Kremlin watchers sit bolt upright was not a quote from a victim. It was a line on a Russian form, a bonus to a Unit 29155 officer, for work on the potential capabilities of non-lethal acoustic weapons. Pair that with the resume of Colonel Ivan Terentiev, Deputy Commander of 29,155, a trained engineer who co-authored military scientific papers and whose aide, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Isov, left behind an addendum describing urban combat potential for such weapons. Add a 2010 Russian program that built a portable ultrasonic non-lethal weapons prototype mountable on commercial vehicles and a declassified Soviet-era project, Reductor, the task to Kharkiv Institute with studying electromagnetic radiation to alter the behavior and reactions of biological objects, including people. This is not a microwave gun schematic, it is institutional intent and R&D habit, connecting Soviet biophysics to post-2010 urban kit. The exact scene where a black Mercedes near a laundry window stops being a coincidence and starts being a platform. The Florida thread turned the plot into a Coen Brothers outtake. In 2020, a Florida deputy chased a speeding Ford Mustang 15 miles at 110 miles per hour to a stop. The driver, Vitaly Kovalev, Russian passport, trained military electrical engineer turned inexplicable New York chef, was arrested. Inside the car, deputies found notes of bank accounts and an odd handheld device that could wipe the car's computer, including GPS logs. Over months, an FBI agent named Carey, last name withheld, interviewed him for roughly 80 hours as part of cases involving Russian spies. Then, in 2021, Carey herself experienced a blast of right-sided oral pain at home in Florida, a dentist drill on steroids, fired straight through a window into the inner ear, followed by phone battery swelling to the point it broke the case, loss of consciousness, and a months-long cognitive slide she described as like early Alzheimer's. A year later, she reported a second nocturnal episode in California. She would later undergo surgeries for dehiscence, a literal thinning and breach of the temporal bone overlying the inner ear. You do not have to endorse every junction in the Kovalev timeline to notice the motif: counterintelligence on Russia, then incidents, then neurological and vestibular damage. When 60 Minutes correspondents asked the Pentagon's former task force lead on these cases, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Greg Ed Green, "Are we being attacked?" He answered with the bluntness of someone who has seen enough unclassified edges to draw a classified contour: "Yes, by Russia." He described a pattern in which top-performing officers, often with a Russian nexus, were neutralized, out of billets by traumatic brain injuries and persistent vestibular dysfunction. In the same broadcast, reporters revealed a previously unpublicized case at the July 2023 NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. A senior Defense Department official sought medical treatment after an incident, a location and moment freighted with Russian strategic interest. One can argue about instrument readings and artifact correction. It's harder to argue with targeting logic that tracks exactly where you'd aim a harassment capability to rattle decision loops. The pushback from official Washington did not melt away in the face of new reporting, it hardened into boilerplate. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence's 2023 Community Assessment judged it very unlikely that a foreign adversary was responsible for the broad set of anomalous health incidents, a judgment reiterated in an updated document released in January 2025 that, while acknowledging analytic gaps and differing agency confidence levels, kept the headline conclusion: no smoking gun tying a foreign actor to the bulk of cases. That posture infuriated victims and delighted Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov dismissed the joint media findings as baseless the day they landed. And yet congressional interest grew teeth. Hearings, document demands, an interim House report skeptical of the ODNI's frame, and a Senate Intelligence Committee critique of CIA case handling even as the Senate echoed the very unlikely attribution for most incidents. The epistemic discomfort is the point: parallel narratives, one elite media forensic, one institutional intelligence conservative, both claiming rigor, each accusing the other of bias, one of omission, one of commission. Medical Science in 2024 added a further solvent. 2 new lead papers in JAMA reported no MRI detectable brain injury and no consistent biomarker differences between affected federal employees and carefully matched controls, though they did find persistent imbalance and elevated fatigue, PTSD, and depression scores, outcomes you'd expect after either a physiological insult that left subtle traces below current detection thresholds or a terrifying, life-rearranging event that scrambles stress systems. Critics noted that null MRI findings do not falsify a pulsed energy hypothesis, especially if exposures were transient and injuries microscopic or vestibular rather than parenchymal. Defenders argued that in a cohort that size, the absence of gross structural or connectivity patterns weighs heavily. Meanwhile, the National Academy's 2020 panel had earlier deemed directed, pulsed radiofrequency energy a plausible mechanism for the acute symptom pattern, directional sound illusions, one-sided head pressure, sudden vestibular collapse, even as it rejected simple psychogenesis as a sufficient explanation for the initial events. If you're a physicist, you hear Fry effect and start sketching power densities and beam widths. If you're a clinician, you hear canal dehiscence and start sketching how badly ultrasound can shake a semicircular canal when it couples through glass, air, and bone. The science doesn't so much disagree as point to the boundaries of today's instruments. What the joint investigation did better than anyone else was connect capability to choreography. In the Russian source base, non-lethal acoustic weapons is a capacious category that hides a marriage of convenience, ultrasonics in air or coupled through solids to perturb vestibular organs, and radiofrequency, microwave, pulses that create auditory sensations via thermoelastic expansion within cranial tissue. Both can present to victims as sound. Both can be directed. Both scale with power and proximity. Both, in various Soviet and Russian programs, were studied as means of altering cognition, balance, and behavior without overt burns or concussions. The insider surfaced a Soviet patent from 1974 for an RF-based sleep-inducing device and later literature, 1991 to 2012, on transmitting simulated auditory information to targets using very high frequencies. That lineage matters because it supplies motive and method for a unit whose day job is sabotage. No one disputes 29,155's plots to explode depots and poison defectors. The only question is whether you believe they'd view neurologically harassing American officials as below their pay grade. The record suggests the opposite. It also helped that the targets and geographies made operational sense. Frankfurt in 2014 sits inside the first year of Moscow's open war on Ukraine, when tit-for-tat below the threshold, grey zone, punishment of adversaries, became doctrine with budget lines. Tbilisi in 2021 is a nerve bundle for Russian counterintelligence, with American law enforcement attachés and intelligence officers coaching regional partners. Vilnius in 2023 hosted a NATO summit centered on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Washington, Vienna, Berlin, London, Delhi, Hanoi, Guangzhou, each city that lit up with reports was also a city where Western officers and their families lived in patterns that a competent service could surveil. The reporting placed 29,155 officers across that map, in Geneva hotel registers while Frankfurt rang, in Tbilisi phone logs when a nurse met a blonde phantom. In a gate, in the metadata of men whose work histories read like seminars in wet ops. Plausibility is not proof, but geography is a witness with a good memory. For the victims, the argument over attribution is academic in the bitter way triage is academic. The GAO documented how injured personnel ricocheted between agencies and care pathways. Lawyers with clearances shouted, cover up, less as a theory of geopolitics than as a description of bureaucratic incentives. A parade of public health language, AHIs, care coordination, compensation under the Havana Act, disguised the mundane cruelty of delays and disbelief. Inside that human mess, patterns still peek through. FBI personnel whose common thread, their attorney says, was Russia work. CIA officers who suffered incidents after tours in Ukraine or Georgia. An NSC official hit outside the Eisenhower Executive Office building in 2020. The Deputy Chief of Staff to CIA Director Bill Burns struck in Delhi in 2021, prompting the director to cut short a trip. There are benign stories you can tell about randomness, these are not those stories. Physics refuses to pick a side until someone shows it a device, but it will happily grade your homework. If you posit ultrasound, you must solve for coupling and attenuation. Air is a poor conduit, line of sight through an open or thinly glazed window is friendlier. A vehicle-mounted source parking at curb distance could deliver painful intensities at the skull with steep fall-off beyond a narrow beam, leaving neighbors unaffected. If you posit RF pulses, you must solve for power density and focusing. Modern solid-state RF sources can deliver microsecond pulses that cause intracranial thermoelastic expansion, perceived as clicks or buzzing from inside, with little external acoustic signature. The beam transits glass and air better than ultrasound, but at ranges of tens to hundreds of meters you need antenna aperture and aim stability a street-parked car can provide. Both mechanisms explain lateralized onset, sudden vestibular collapse, and rapid recovery in some cases. Neither shows up as a convenient lesion on a conventional MRI. That is not mystical, it is engineering. Journalistically, the 2024 collaboration earned its authority the old-fashioned way, by being specific. It named operatives, Avarianov the younger, Gordienko the watcher, Terentiev the engineer, Izhov the aide with the telltale email, Kaprilov the officer with a medical background landing in Geneva on October 15, 2014. It traced their passports, real and counterfeit, across Schengen timetables. It matched faces to victims' memories without theatrical confidence, offering, looks like, where certainty would have been too neat. It placed a suspicious Mercedes opposite a laundry window and then, in a different hemisphere and year, placed an FBI agent in front of a cardiologist after a phone battery bloated like bread dough in an oven. And it did the most unglamorous thing of all. It went back to 2014 and insisted that the first act of a play often explains the finale. None of this erases the null findings in March 2024, and none of those findings erase a paper trail of Russian R&D, travel, promotions, and presence. The contradiction is only apparent if you insist that one genre of evidence invalidates the other. Brains are exquisitely fragile and often resilient. Vestibular organs can be wrecked by energies that spare cortex. An assault measured in milliseconds may leave consequences measured in years without drawing a neat line on an MRI. Conversely, an intelligence community that must brief a country without starting a war may demand an evidentiary bar so high that only a recovered device with a serial number will do. Both instincts are understandable, only one helps a nurse in Tbilisi walk downstairs again without rehearsing each step. There is, of course, the chance that some fraction of the global case pool is noise, misattributed migraines, stress collapses, ordinary otologic pathologies recruited by rumor. But the 2024 reporting did not describe memes, it described methods. It did not rest on the authority of anonymous officials, it quoted the budget lines of a Black Ops unit and the hotel clerks of Geneva. And when the Kremlin called it all fiction, it did so with the weary tempo of a government that has had to deny, in sequence, a poisoning in Salisbury, depot blasts in Verbtis, a coup plot in Podgorica, and the daily arithmetic of an invasion. Pattern recognition is not the same as proof, but it is unacceptable to call it hysteria. At some point, the simplest hypothesis is that the people who blow things up also try to quiet it all. The moral, if you need one, is that modern statecraft includes weapons that hide in physiology and in the calibration limits of clinical research. A century ago, Charles Fort collected reins of frogs. Today, investigative teams collect the itineraries of saboteurs and the receipts of device prototypes built to sit under a top in a civilian SUV. The terrain is the same: confusion, fear, institutionally convenient doubt, but the instrumentation is better, and the forensic trail includes LTE pings and procurement language. What broke through in 2024 was not certainty, it was coherence. A unit with a documented appetite for clandestine harm appears in place after place. Victims describe acute, localized, directional onsets that match known physics. The United States' own scientific panels call an energy mechanism plausible. The null MRIs deny nothing except the fantasy that every crime draws a visible bruise. If you're demanding a serial numbered emitter on a courtroom table, you may get it someday. Until then, the 2024 collaboration did what science and journalism do at their best. It reduced the number of lies we can tell ourselves and made the remaining ones harder to say without stuttering. Open the knee folder and the romance leaks out. The 2018 to 2019 wave of imaging that made headlines, Regini Verma's JAMA paper out of pen comparing dozens of Havana exposed personnel to matched controls, Douglas Smith's group talking about diffuse axonal injury analogies, Michael Hoffer's vestibular and auditory battery that found real-world deficits on balance and saccades, was followed in March 2024 by two very large, very sober knee-led studies in JAMA that did the thing sober studies do: they flattened the story. Leighton Chan's team ran serial structural and diffusion MRI plus quantitative neuropsychological testing on a cohort drawn from multiple posts, and they did not find a reproducible, injury-like brain signature compared with carefully recruited controls. No hippocampal shrinkage pattern, no white matter microstructural fingerprint that survived scanner harmonization, no group-level cognitive crater once you controlled for sleep, mood, and test-retest effects. A companion knee paper marched through serum neurodegeneration biomarkers, NFL, tau, audiology, and vestibular endpoints and landed on the same unromantic square. Abnormalities existed case by case, but nothing pattern-tight enough to hang a general mechanism on. Stack those against the National Academy's 2020 report, whose committee, after reading the same Penn and Miami dossiers, called, directed, pulsed radiofrequency energy, the most plausible cause for at least a subset of early Cuba cases, and you can hear the epistemology groan. Early case series suggest, blue ribbon panel infers, a big prospective cohort refuses to certify. Add ODNI's 2023 community assessment, very unlikely, a foreign adversary was behind most incidents, plausible, that some remain unexplained, and you get the paradox small wars and big bureaucracies specialize in. The farther you get from the hotel room, the cleaner the data, the worse it is at explaining the hotel room. The laboratory physics that let the Academy say, pulsed RF, without blushing is not sci-fi and, inconveniently, it's older than most of us. In 1961 to 1962 Alan H. Fry reported the RF hearing phenomenon, humans perceiving clicks and chirps when pulsed microwave fields strike the head, an effect nailed down through the 1970s by James C. Lin and others as thermoelastic. Microsecond pulses deposit a wafer of heat in tissue, tissue expands by microns, a pressure wave launches, the cochlea registers it as sound. Lin's 1978 monograph and Foster and Cho's 1980 for analyses turned folklore into thresholds. You need high peak power with low average power, pulse widths in the microsecond neighborhood, repetition rates in the tens to hundreds of hertz, and time-gated energy deposition that produces an intracranial acoustic wave on the order of pascals. That stack gets you the subjective, click, chirp, or pressure, reported at Cuba and Guangzhou. The geometry is quietly lethal. You want line of sight through a window or thin wall. You want a beam with enough aperture to keep divergence small over tens of meters. You want a pulse generator fast and coherent enough that you can sculpt duty cycle and avoid cooking your target. Compare that to the 1953 to 1976 Moscow signal, when the US Embassy sat bathed for years in low-level microwaves from across the street. The flux densities there were microwatts per square centimeter at SC band, much too weak to create fry clicks, but the history told every intel service on Earth that power and beam control could be delivered covertly through glass. When the National Academies wrote in 2020 that pulsed RF appears to be the most plausible mechanism, they were not imagining a new force, they were cashing out 60 years of audiology and radar math. Do the arithmetic naked, no cloak and dagger, no acronyms, and it is awkward but possible. To produce an intracranial pressure transient on the order of 1 to 10 pascals via thermoelastic expansion in soft tissue, you need local temperature excursions of ~10·5·10·4 K per pulse, with tissue absorption coefficients at 2 to 4 GHz and pulse widths of a few microseconds, that backs out to peak-specific absorption rates of hundreds of W/kg during the pulse, which are surprisingly attainable when the average duty cycle is low. Translate peak SAR to field strengths and power flux. At room size standoff, you are talking tens to hundreds of MW cm2 peak at the head with duty cycles below 1%, so that average flux stays in the comfortable MW cm2 range. That is not a garage toy, it's also not a physics impossibility. Aperture control is the whole trick. A 20 to 30 cm effective antenna at 3 GHz has a few degrees of beam width. At 30 meters your spot is a meter scale, loose enough to miss a sleeping spouse but tight enough to keep a hallway dark. The risk calculus is what makes the stomach drop. Line of sight through louvered blinds in a Havana guest house is one thing, an apartment across Johannesgas in Vienna or a hotel on Ulitsa Tverskaya in Moscow is another. The thing that keeps engineers honest is the back of envelope on window losses, wall attenuation, and multipath, even with 3 to 10 dB penalties per surface. A drive-up shot from a parked van with a horn in a duffel is not absurd if the only sensation you need to deliver is a train of small intracranial clicks and a vestibular insult. The clinical aftermath, nausea, disequilibrium, photophobia, does not require burning tissue, it requires beating the vestibular system with a hammer you cannot see. Ultrasound is the cousin that shows up to Thanksgiving with impressive shoes and the wrong passport. Parametric acoustic arrays, Westervelt's 1963 math, Yoniyama's 1983 audio spotlights, the commercial devices you can buy now to beam sound across a museum gallery, use high-frequency ultrasound, 40 to 100 kHz, amplitude modulated with an audible signal. Nonlinear propagation demodulates the envelope in air, spawning a very narrow audible beam that can paint one person's ear and leave their neighbor in quiet. On paper that could explain a directional sound in a room that goes away when you step sideways. In practice the Havana geometry bites. Air absorbs ultrasound aggressively. Window glass and plaster eat it for breakfast. Airborne parametric beams lose their knife edge once you're off axis. And the power required to shove enough modulated ultrasound through a window and redemodulate it inside without rattling everything on the bookshelf is real. Could you do a near-field trick from the next room or through a thin hotel wall? Yes, with a horn and an unfortunate taste for lawsuits. Could you scale that to multiple continents and leave essentially no hardware trail? Much harder. The more interesting ultrasound avenue runs not through air but bone. Transcranial focused ultrasound can poke the vestibular labyrinth and motor cortex at low intensities. Lab work over the last decade has shown reproducible, reversible modulation of human perception with 250 to 700 kHz waves focused through skull windows. But that requires a coupling medium, gel, close range, and a rig. It's a bench experiment, not a parking lot toy. Chemistry keeps sending a postcard with a plausible postmark. In 2016, Cuba did what every mosquito-terrorized country did and doubled down on vector control. Larvicides such as temifos and adulticides such as pyrethroids were deployed widely in cities as Zika fear crested. A Canadian government-funded investigation of Canadian diplomats, 2019, reported cholinesterase inhibition, depressed serum BCHE and RBCA, and diffusion MRI differences consistent with low-dose organophosphate exposure. Their mechanistic argument was elegant. A heavy fogging campaign plus poor ventilation in some residences equals subclinical OP dosing that would hit vestibular function and cognition. Against that hypothesis, the tight acoustical phenomenology in many index cases, it came from one corner of the room, I stepped behind a column and it stopped, the episodic on-off kinetics within minutes, and the recurrences years later in Tbilisi, Guangzhou, and Vienna where the fogging chemistry and schedule were different. Organophosphates can decorate a story. They are lousy at writing a chapter that starts with a narrow beam a meter wide. Still, if you lived in Havana in 2016 to 2017 and your bedroom was a downwind experiment, a cholinesterase baseline belongs in your medical file, and the Canadian biomarker findings deserve to sit on the table next to the radar math and not under it. The most memed culprit, the Havana sound, published by the AP in 2017, turned out to be a bar joke with a Latin binomial. In 2019, Alex Stubbs and Fernando Montilagazed compared the AP audio to field recordings of Anurogrillus celerinictus, a loud Caribbean short-tailed cricket. The pulse repetition rates, carrier frequencies, and amplitude modulation were absurdly close. Play the species call over a portable speaker in a courtyard, add hard walls and a smartphone microphone designed to make human speech pretty, and you will get the exact teeth-grinding sonic texture that went viral. That is an elegant paste-over for a slice of the story. Many people heard a loud, weird night sound in buildings that reflected into torture. Many people recorded it. A species explained a waveform. It does nothing for the cases where there was no audible sound, only a sudden head squeeze, a directional tactile hiss inside the skull, a nausea that obeyed the geometry of a window and stopped when a victim moved behind a marble pillar in a hotel lobby. It is not insulting to the victims to say, crickets ate the microphone, and something else pinned your vestibular system. The worst vice in anomalies work is insisting on a single father when the birth certificates disagree. Mass psychogenic illness is a phrase with a history and a bad bedside manner, and it is absolutely part of this landscape because humans are exquisitely social. If you need a control case outside geopolitics, remember the 1962 June bug outbreak at a southern U.S. textile mill. Hugh Jones wrote it up like a murder mystery. Dozens fainting, nausea, itching, 0 arthropods, the 1983 West Bank school faints, hundreds of girls across multiple towns, symptoms pacing rumor and media visits, WHO team concluding psychogenic spread, and even the 2006 Portuguese strawberries with sugar cluster where a TV plotline about a mystery illness wrote itself onto bodies in classrooms. AHR reports contain the right ingredients: sleep disruption, travel stress, power, asymmetry, frightening stories circulated by trusted colleagues, and clinical neuropsychologists in 2020 to 2024 pointed out that a subset of reported cognitive deficits look like functional impairments that improve with sleep, time, and are threatening the narrative. The NIH 2024 studies, importantly, showed that mood and sleep covary with some test performance, and that context matters as much as cortex. None of this negates the index events that look like someone measured your head with a silent yardstick. It just constrains the part of the curve that was built by fear. The grown-up posture here says two sentences at once. Psychogenic spread is real in social mammals and can decorate any mystery. Psychogenic spread cannot generate a pulsed, directional intracranial click that ceases when you step behind a Doric column. The way out of the trench fight is the way we climb out of most Fortean brawls, except a mosaic. The National Academy's 2020 plausibility argument for pulsed RF explains it came from that direction, then stopped when I moved stories in early, tightly documented cases in Cuba and China. The NIH 2024 pair subtract a global, reproducible brain injury signature from the overall pile. ODNI's 2023 synthesis says the majority of the pile does not require an adversary. The Canadian cholinesterase story gives a chemical background that could turn a few nervous systems brittle in the presence of an acute insult. The cricket paper takes a viral audio and puts it in a terrarium, right where it belongs. The remainder is where the investigative oxygen ought to go, case-by-case reconstructions with geometry, spectra, and biomarkers, not vibes. If you grew up on Cold War Arcana, the remainder looks like a familiar map. Sometimes a signal is a signal, sometimes it is nothing at all. The median is bad sleep and a bad boss. What would competence have looked like in 2016 to 2017, and what does it look like in 2025? It is not a Pelican case full of EMF toys from an online store, those red 50/60 Hz mains hum and Wi-Fi, and it is not a ghost detector. It is an RF front end that can watch 1 to 10 GHz with microsecond time resolution and synchronized logging, a small phased array or at least 2 antennas to localize line of sight sources by time difference of arrival, calibrated microphones for both audible and ultrasound with proper windshields, a vestibular auditory test kit that lives in a backpack, VOR gain, CVEMP, OVEMP, pure tone audiometry, with normative data for the exact age, sex, occupation profile you expect, a blood tube fake, BCHE. And a freezer that actually freezes, a wearable accelerometer to quantify gait and sway, and a chain of custody that would make a crime lab blush. It also looks like pre-registration. If you are going to call something an anomalous health incident, you define your case criteria in advance and you publish your nulls with the same fanfare as your hits. The most boring upgrade of all would have paid early. Every living space used by at-risk personnel gets a 24/7 RF recorder that hashes data to a tamper evidence store, and a network time-stamped accelerometer on the building to fingerprint trucks idling outside. If the thing is a beam, capture the beam. If it is a cricket, record the cricket. If it is a dream, let the clean trace shame the nightmare into retreat. There is a philosophical itch that this case is perfect for scratching. In the 1970s, after the Moscow signal, but before compact digital storage, the US built more theory than dataset. In 2020 to 2024, after Penn, NASM, and NIH, we have more dataset than theory. The way those two eras rhyme is the primacy of priors. If you start with adversary, you notice chalk line geometries and ignore sleep. If you start with mass psychogenic, you ignore the person who hears a click inside their skull only when they are on a particular balcony at Grand Manzana Kempinski. Good anomalistics, fought with a badge and a mass spectrometer, doesn't start with either. It starts with space, time, and energy. Where were you standing? What was between you and the glass? What did a calibrated antenna see? What did your vestibular ocular reflex do in the hour after? What did your serum say about life in a fogged city last year? That posture, hard measurements first, humor allowed, romance withheld until earned, does not erase malice, it makes malice work harder. 100-year horizon is not a joke prediction of death rays, it is an administrative prediction about sensors. By 2125, if a diplomat says, I just got hit, the wallpaper, not the witness, will be the primary. Buildings will run continuous RF spectrograms with microsecond snapshots and store them the way elevators store maintenance logs. Vestibular baselines will live in your badge. Your room's double-glazed window will be a spectrum analyzer that phones the network when it sees a pulse train arrive from across the street. Near-ultrasound arrays will pin their own alibis to the wall. The implication for the present is delightfully unromantic. Until we make that world, you do the low-tech things that would have saved the first year. Put an RF head in every suspect bedroom, take blood within hours, record sleep, and pre-register your case definitions so you stop moving the goalposts every time a new paper arrives. Meanwhile, the human part won't change. You will still need clinicians who can tell a functional impairment from a lesion, acoustic ecologists who can separate a cricket from a panicking microphone, and physicists who will say out loud, in rooms that dislike hearing it, that you can build a pulsed beam that makes a click in a skull without burning anything and that a clever adversary might try. Which loops us back, impolitely, to the geopolitical suspicion you can't quite evict from this case even when the knee tells you to tidy your desk. Covertly directed RF is feasible with off-the-shelf parts and modest RF literacy. Older services explored it at power densities that would never pass a human subject's review, and a modern unit with access, motive, and a talent for grey zone mischief could test drive it wherever hotel windows are honest and guards are not. That is not a claim, it is the risk register an adult has to hold while the hospitals argue. The part worth defending in public, loudly, is methodological. If you want to prove a beam, you bring a spectrum. If you want to prove a panic, you bring a sleep log and a cohort. If you want to prove a pesticide, you bring cholinesterase and a fogging ledger. And if you want a lecture to end neatly, you pick the wrong phenomenon. The right closure here is an assignment. One hand on Fry's 1961 graph, one on the NIH's 2024 tables, one on a field recorder pointed at a Havana courtyard, and the last hand, because this topic needs four, available to pull someone behind a column the instant they say, it's coming from there, and then write down exactly how the world changes when they do. The file drawer labeled, what we still don't know, is not empty, it is ruthlessly specific. It contains thresholds and time constants, not metaphors. If a person in a guest house in late 2016 hears clicking that seems to originate inside the skull and the next day fails a vestibulo-ocular reflex test at high accelerations, what was the waveform at the ear canal in the 10 seconds before the click? What was the electric field strength 20 centimeters from the head in the 1 to 10 GHz band when their pupils decided to argue with a light? What did their otoliths, those calcium carbonate pebbles that tell you which way is down, report during the minute their world tipped without furniture moving? If you can't answer with numbers, you don't have a mystery, you have an anecdote under oath. This is not contempt. It is the only reliable way out. The most pitiless lesson baked into every anomalous health incident file is that small sensory systems can be bullied in precise ways by signals too boring to survive television. The auditory system will happily hallucinate a sound if the cochlea's outer hair cells are forced into amplitude modulation at tens of kilohertz and the brainstem sees a pulse train that rides the line between perception and thermal insult. The vestibular system can be mugged by subaudible vibration conducted through floors and drywall into the mastoid, a physics problem whose solution includes the density of gypsum board and the modal frequencies of a room, not a demon. The visual system will cough up phosphons under electric fields in the tens of volts per meter. The somatosensory cortex can be talked into tingling when a person hyperventilates because they think the room itself is risky. The sheer pettiness of these mechanisms, ion channels twitching at microsecond scales, phase-locked loops in the midbrain grabbing at a beat they didn't ask for, makes them formidable adversaries in an investigation. They are not dramatic. They are reproducible. So the adult version of a field kit is a collection of things that make drama impossible. You build a nest of synchronized recorders, a GNSS-disciplined 10 MHz reference clock, because when you compare a pulse in room A to a flicker in room B 6 kilometers away, absolute time better be right. A broadband RF spectrum front end with high dynamic range, sampling continuously from, say, 100 kHz to 6 GHz in cascaded windows with peak hold so a millisecond burst doesn't hide between FFT hops. A microwave near-field probe array around head height on a tripod, because the spatial structure of a field tells you what a source could have been, an ultrasonic microphone and a contact accelerometer on the walls and bed frame, logging at 192 kHz or above so a 35 to 90 kHz tone doesn't dress up as silence, an infrasound microbarograph for 0.02 to 20 Hz, because gravity waves and HVAC can cosplay as menace in long rooms, and, crucially, a tamper-evident ring buffer that is always sampling even when no human thinks there is a show. You pair each physical logger with a physiological one, CVMP and OVMP for otolith pathways, VHIT to measure vestibulo-ocular reflex gain across high-frequency head impulses, DPOAs to see if outer hair cells lost their joie de vivre, high-frequency audiometry out to 16 to 20 kHz for subtle basal turn injuries, pupillometry in a dark room to quantify sympathetic noise. You don't wait for events to happen and then build a lab from scratch, you leave the instruments installed like smoke alarms and live with the boredom. The RF part matters because it is where most loud arguments die and a few survive. Broadband ambient in a modern city is not mysterious, the usual suspects, LTE, Wi-Fi at 2.4 and 5 GHz, radar, microwave links, a hospital's telemetry, draw signatures you can recognize the way an electrician recognizes a bad neutral. A malicious narrowband source at, say, 915 MHz with a pulse repetition frequency of hundreds of Hz and a duty cycle designed to flirt with the thermal time constant of soft tissue will not look like those. It will draw a comb where there shouldn't be a comb and hand you a wavelength and a geometry you can triangulate with a second station 2 streets away. The acoustic band is just as rude. Audible pure tones at 8 to 14 kHz are easy, cheap phone chargers manufacture them like a hobby. Ultrasound between 25 and 60 kHz can couple through air poorly but through solids indecently well, A beam in air will die in a meter, a beam in a wall will hold formation through rooms. Infrasound below 10 Hz propagates like gossip in a monastery, slowly but everywhere. As with every other class of anomaly in this course, you don't solve it by adjectives, you solve it by signatures. The brain piece is where most investigations in the last decade have been both too credulous and too stingy. If you drop a person into an MRI and ask the machine to tell you whether something happened, you get 1,000 voxels of personality and the universal language of incidental omas. DTI metrics on white matter tracks will misbehave a bit if a person is dehydrated, if the scanner's gradients are sulking, if motion correction lost the argument with panic. Electroencephalograms will reward an anxious subject with beta noise and an investigator with interpretive freedom. The cure is not to abandon the brain, it is to move down a level to inputs and outputs that don't care about theory. Saccades, smooth pursuit, optokinetic nystagmus, posturography with eyes open and shut, galvanic vestibular stimulation, calorics, head shake tests with eyes on target. It reads like physiotherapy until you realize each item is a canal or otolith test with a try-fail outcome and a asymmetric expectation. You can fake your narrative, you cannot fake a phase lead. If someone wanted to coerce this messy system on purpose, the menu is shorter than cable news would have you believe and more technical than a spy thriller admits. A pulsed RF source can induce microwave auditory perception, the Fry effect, if peak power at the head clears tens of MW, cm2 and the pulse widths and repetition rates suit thermoelastic expansion in cranial bone. The sensation is a click or a buzz in the head, not a melody. The thresholds climb with duty cycle because thermal diffusion catches up. The effect is directional only in a loose, infuriating way. Because skulls are better acousticians than antennas. Non-auditory RF bioeffects are possible at higher exposures. Transient heating yields conduction changes and a bloom of perception. But to make them specific you need proximity, power, or trickery with reflections and focusing that collapse under a spectrum analyzer. Ultrasound in air can abuse the auditory system through demodulation. Parametric arrays make audible byproducts in a pencil beam, or rattle the vestibular apparatus through bone conduction if you have a loud source glued to a surface. It does not reach around corners and strobe a single person in a building while a neighbor reads in peace unless the neighbor is across a node in an eigenmode. Infrasound can make people miserable if you ask buildings to be instruments. C2L shows up in rooms whether you like physics or not, but the symptom list is nausea and headache and irritability with a strong temporal correlation to the tone. Mystical reports of permanent neurological injury complete with radiology are the point where you put your pen down and ask for blood work and a ventilated laboratory. There is also the possibility, consistent with too many files, that nobody needed an RF source or a Pieto stack to start this fire. An expectation engine in 6 or 8 adults, primed by rumor and policy and a social network with redundancy, will write symptoms into bodies with a vigor no gadget can match. That does not trivialize suffering, it mechanizes it. Functional neurological disorders are not malingering, they are honest brains reaching bad equilibria. Hyperventilation mislabels tingling as threat, the threat raises arousal, the loop closes. Midbrain pattern generators enslave limbs into tremor that vanishes under distraction. Vestibular migraine gates the world without a headache, then answers a quiet room by inventing motion. The sufferer is not lying and the scanner is bored, the oculomotor lab wins. Your ethics must make room for this. You cannot promise a technological culprit because a person needs a villain. You can promise to test 3 classes of mechanism, electromagnetic, acoustic, and functional, physiological, without deciding in advance which one gets to be sexy. If you want an image of how the 100-year horizon will work when the next capital city swears at its hotel curtains, trade the trench coat for a network map. By 2035, RF monitoring will be as decentralized as amateur meteorology. Neighborhood ham radio clubs already log spectrum like day traders. By 2050, a dual-use mesh of civilian and municipal sensors will log transients from 0.1 Hz to 100 GHz with timestamps disciplined by GNSS and PTP. Litigation will spawn chain of custody standards for waveforms the way drunk driving law spawns standards for blood. Sensor fusion will be ordinary. An event ID will tie a person's pupillometry trace and VOR gain on a Tuesday at 19:21:0 for Z to a 2.8 GHz burst at -48 dBm measured near the headboard, a 40 kHz tone at 62 dB SPL on a wall contact MIC, and a neighbor's microbaron blip that draws the infrasound baseline back to a passing front. By 2075, urban planners will draw RF and ultrasonic, quiet zones, into building codes the way they draw smoke compartments and fire doors now. And insurers will price premiums inversely to your building's acoustic Q factor and your hotel's willingness to prove that the bedroom door does not host a narrowband resonance in the vestibular pain range. By 2125, a home will not only brag about fiber to the curb, it will brag about gap-free spectrograms to the archive and a public key on a blockchain that notarizes the boredom. The laboratory side will look like a composer's workshop and an ethics committee's migraine. If you truly want to prove that a class of signal can cause a class of symptom in human physiology at field-realistic levels, you will not do it with a press conference or an N=1. You will pre-register a protocol, you will recruit subjects who do not already live in the theory, you will blind exposure with sham runs and catch trials, you will measure endpoints that don't care whether a person believes a signal is present, VOR gain, DPOE growth functions, pupillary reflex latency, posturography sway area. You will define thresholds in WM2 or PAR or VM and publish the power time product that hurts and the one that doesn't. You will do it with enough statistical power that a skeptical lab can replicate it without borrowing your poet. If the culprit is a device with a surname and a serial number, you will own yourself faster than any investigation can, because beam patterns and spurious emissions do not flush from the record when you unplug the wall. There is a political economy problem embedded in all of this that does not care whether you prefer your villains with rank tabs or with Reddit usernames. Intelligence agencies are built to hoard signal and cultivate ambiguity. Public health thrives on pre-commitment and the swift murder of ambiguity. A foreign ministry wants a story that holds a press conference together. A neurologist wants a day on a vestibular chair and a CSV. When those two cultures share a case, you get the worst of both, the expectation of secrets without the discipline of censors. The fix is procedural and unromantic. You write down, before the next event cluster, exactly which instruments trigger exactly which notifications to exactly which independent labs. You define what can be released without killing an operation. You preposition third-party recorders in living quarters, not just offices. You agree that a blinded VOR abnormality is chemistry or physics until proven otherwise and that a normal panel is not an argument for perfidy. You tie budgets to boredom. Agencies that instrument well in peacetime get more money, agencies that write adjectives in a vacuum get less. You also, if you are serious about not injuring the people you claim to defend, put vestibular migraine, PPPD, persistent postural perceptual dizziness, and functional neurological disorders into the staff clinic not as diagnoses of exclusion but as first-line differential diagnoses with protocols that work. You train physicians to do the dull things that obviously help. Gradual exposure to motion rather than hiding from it, hydration and salt, abortives and preventives for the migraine brain that never admits it is a migraine brain, cognitive behavioral therapy that tells the nervous system it can stop defending itself from phantom cliffs. You do this because even in a world with hostile waveforms, the base rate for human nervous systems stuck in bad loops is high, and the cure for those is a course of days, not a press release. You can keep a sense of humor here without becoming cruel. There is a way to talk about pulsed RF energy and parametric arrays and cranial thermoelastic clicks without turning into a cable host. There is a way to talk about nocebo and attention and vestibular migraine without implying that an embassy full of adults invented nausea to impress the ambassador. Words are fields too. Unknown is better than mystery weapon until you have a waveform. Functional is better than psychogenic because it tells the truth that a function got into a corner and needs a path back. If the adults in the room insist on melodrama, you can borrow from other corners of the anomalous canon. A city's mystery booms are most often microbaroms and offshore thunder ducted over temperature inversions. A county's windshield pits are quartz and attention. The Tausham is a cocktail of low-frequency noise and building resonances with a garnish of human variance. In each case, instrumentation plus base rates turned a ghost into a plot. The plot is better than the ghost because you can fix it. The exit ramp from Havana, then, is not a reveal, it is an infrastructure. Leave behind, in every building where people sleep and every compound where policy collides with rumor, an array that cannot forget, that writes spectra into time the way camera traps write leopards into conservation biology. Leave behind a clinical workflow that prioritizes measurable pathways, the ear, the eye, the inner ear, the autonomic nervous system, over interpretive dance in the radiology suite. Leave behind an ethics whose first principle is that a person in distress deserves a mechanism more than they deserve a villain. When, after all that, a waveform shows up with a father and a return address, you will have already finished half the story. And if no waveform ever shows up, you will have built a clinic that helps anyway. There is a fine, mean satisfaction in imagining the year 2125 and a graduate student yawning through the episode that owned our decade. She will pull the archive with a gesture and find 23 events tagged with good waveforms, for that remain unassigned, because physics is tastier than we think. and a long tail of clusters that track headlines and rumors instead of kilohertz and kilopascals. She will feed the set into a model that learned from a century of dull sensors and spit out probabilities that do not care about our speeches. She will thank a software package for its service, print a figure, and go to lunch. The rest of us will be dead or retired, and the only thing that will matter about our century's strangest diplomatic mystery is whether we left her a record that did not demand a séance. The world will still be doing what it always does, making small assaults on perception with gusts and fields and pulses and pressure, with hormones and expectations and the treachery of rooms. The job was never to make it less strange. The job was to catch it in the act and measure it hard enough that a human being could stop being haunted. So let us grant this episode its last dignity. It was not a parable about gullibility, nor a trapdoor into geopolitics so deep that only acronyms survive the fall. It was a lesson in scale and method. Bodies are exquisitely hackable by the most ordinary physics, institutions are exquisitely distractible by the most ordinary narrative. The cure for both is instrumentation married to humility. The next time a consular official in a pastel hotel room hears a click that has no address, the next time an aide stumbles and the room refuses to settle, there should be a small lead in a corner that says a recorder is bored and a future is safe. Not because boredom is noble, but because boredom is the signature of a world you understand. And if the lead blinks and the spectrogram writes a cone where there should be none, if a VOR game collapses at the same second a wall shivers, the only line left to write is the one that ought to have been written first. Here are the numbers. Here is the mechanism. Here is what actually happened. Here is how we know.